My family ignored me for 28 years and worshipped my sister. But when Grandpa left us $500K each, my parents demanded I give up my inheritance to hand it all to her. So, I sued them, and now she's on my side. My parents are broken. I'm 28 years old, work in finance at a pretty decent company, and honestly, I thought I'd already gotten over all the family drama from my childhood, that I'd made peace with the fact that my parents were always going to prefer my younger sister. But then my grandfather died like 3 months ago, and everything exploded in a way I can't even describe. The thing is that my grandfather, his name was George, left $500,000 for me and $500,000 for my sister Madison. But my parents, Robert and Jennifer, basically tried to steal my share to give it all to her. And when I say they tried to steal from me, I'm not exaggerating even a little bit. I guess I should start from the beginning so this makes sense. Because the truth is that this situation with the inheritance is just the culmination of literally my entire life. I grew up being basically invisible to my parents, while Madison, who's 25 now, was and still is their little golden princess who can do no wrong. And look, I'm not saying this because I'm a bitter sibling who's making stuff up. This is a pattern that started when I was like 5 years old and she had just been born. The first memory I have of this, and it's super specific because it really marked me, was when I turned 7. My parents threw me a super simple party, like store-bought cake and maybe 5 friends, nothing special. But when Madison turned 7, my parents rented an entire hall, hired a magician. There were like 30 kids, decorations everywhere, a giant candy table. I remember standing there at that party thinking, seriously? This is what she gets, and I only got a store-bought cake? And I was like 10 at that point, so I was already starting to realize that something wasn't right. But the incident that really made me understand the magnitude of the situation was the bike thing. I was 10 years old, and I'd been saving my birthday money and money from doing little jobs around the neighborhood for months. Literally months. Because I wanted a specific bike that cost like $200. I finally saved up the money. My parents took me to the store. I bought the bike with my own money, and I was super proud. I'd worked hard for it. Well, 2 weeks later, Madison saw my bike and had a monumental tantrum because she wanted one too. And my parents, without thinking twice, bought her a much better bike than mine, one of those expensive brand ones that easily cost $350. She didn't have to save anything, didn't have to work for it, she just cried and screamed a little and boom, new bike. I just stood there like, are you kidding me? But nobody seemed to see the problem except me. Things continued like that throughout my entire childhood and adolescence, honestly. When I was 12, I had the lead role in the school play. I'd rehearsed for months and was super excited. It was on a Thursday night, and my parents had promised to go. But on the day of the performance, Madison supposedly had a stomach ache. And I say supposedly because it turns out she was perfectly fine. She just wanted attention. And my parents stayed home with her instead of coming to see me. I remember being on stage, looking for them in the audience before the play started, and they weren't there. My teacher asked me if I was okay and I just said yes. But inside I was devastated. That night I got home and my mom, Jennifer, just said, "Oh, Cameron, we're so sorry, but Madison needed us. I'm sure you did great." They didn't even ask me how it went. Fast forward to when I was 17, and I got accepted into an amazing summer program at Harvard, like a super competitive academic camp for outstanding students. It was a huge opportunity for me. But the flight left early Saturday morning and I needed someone to take me to the airport because it was like 5 in the morning. Well, it turns out that same Saturday Madison had a dance recital at 3 in the afternoon, 10 hours later, and my parents said they couldn't take me because they needed to rest for Madison's recital. Like, what? I begged them, explained how important this was for my future, for my college applications, and my dad Robert basically told me to take an Uber or ask a friend. I ended up asking my best friend's parents for help at the time, and it was super humiliating having to explain to them why my own parents couldn't take me. When it came time to apply to colleges, I got accepted to several good universities and got an almost full scholarship. My parents said something like, "Oh, that's nice, Cameron," and went on with their day. But when Madison decided she wasn't going to college to focus on, I don't know what social media thing or something, My parents celebrated her like she'd won the Nobel Prize. Like, our Madison is so mature and knows what she wants, we're so proud she's following her own path. I graduated with honors from college, got an amazing job in finance, bought my own house when I was 27, and basically built a completely independent life without anyone's help. Madison, meanwhile, was still living in my parents' basement without paying rent, no stable job, and they acted like it was admirable that she was finding herself or some nonsense like that. The thing is that over time I'd learned to live with this, you know. I'd gone to therapy, I'd processed the fact that my parents were probably never going to see me the same way they saw Madison, and honestly, I was fine with keeping my distance. I'd see them at Christmas, Thanksgiving, call occasionally, but I didn't expect anything from them emotionally. I'd built my own family of close friends, and my grandmother, Dorothy, my dad's mom, had always been amazing to me. She did see what was happening and always supported me in ways my parents never did. And then my grandfather George died. It was 3 months ago, in August, and it was super hard because he'd also been one of the few people in my family who really treated me like I mattered. My grandfather was a very fair man, very traditional in the good sense, and he always believed in equality and working hard for what you have. He knew about my parents' favoritism. My grandmother had told him several times, but he could never do much about it because, they were his adult children making their own parenting decisions. The day of the will reading was like 2 weeks after the funeral. We were all there. My parents, Madison, my grandmother Dorothy, the lawyers, and some other relatives. The lawyer started reading the will, and we got to the inheritance part. My grandfather had been pretty successful. He had properties, investments, all that kind of stuff, and he'd left very specific instructions. The main house went to my grandmother, obviously. Some properties were being sold and the money divided among various relatives, and then we got to the grandchildren part. The lawyer said very clearly, for my grandchildren Cameron and Madison, I leave $500,000 to each, to be received when they turn 25 or immediately if they have already reached that age. We'd both passed 25. Madison had just turned 25, like 3 months before my grandfather died. I was shocked. $500,000. It was an amount of money I'd never imagined having. I could pay off my student loans completely. I could invest. I could finally have real financial security. I looked at Madison, and she also seemed surprised but happy. I thought, well, this is amazing. Grandpa left us both exactly the same amount. How fair and generous. My parents looked weird, like uncomfortable, but I didn't think much of it at the time. After the will reading, we all went to my grandmother's house for the typical post-funeral gathering where you eat sad sandwiches and talk in low voices. I was in the kitchen when my parents approached me, and my dad had that face he makes when he's about to ask you something, but is trying to act casual. He said, "Cameron, we need to talk to you about the inheritance." And I was like, "Okay, what's up?" And that's when they dropped the bomb. My mom, Jennifer, started with, Madison is going through a tough time right now, and this money would really help her get established. And I was confused because I thought she was already going to receive her $500,000. So what were they talking about? And my dad said, "Well, we think the fair thing would be for you to give your share to Madison because you already have a good job and a house, and she really needs the help right now." I literally stood there with my mouth open. I said, "Are you serious? She's already receiving $500,000. Why would I have to give her mine too?" And my mom did that thing she always does where she puts on a martyr face and says, "Oh, Cameron, you've always been so selfish with your sister. She's family. Don't you care about her well-being?" I told them no, that Grandpa had been very clear that each of us should receive the same amount and that I wasn't going to give up my inheritance. My dad turned red, super angry, and said that since he was one of the executors of the will, he could make sure things were done the right way. Those were his exact words. The right way. As if my grandfather had made a mistake, leaving us equal amounts. I couldn't believe it. I told them this was ridiculous, that they had no right to ask me this, and I left before I completely exploded. Like 2 weeks passed, and I got a call from the estate lawyer saying we needed to have a meeting because a complication had arisen with the will. I went to that meeting and there were my parents with their own lawyer, and basically my dad, Robert, had filed a motion, or I don't know what it's called legally, but he was trying to redirect my share of the inheritance to Madison. His argument was that I was financially stable and didn't need the money, while Madison was struggling and I needed it more. I was in absolute shock. My own father was literally trying to steal my inheritance. The will had a specific clause, and the lawyer read it to us word for word, that said if any executor tried to alter or contest the terms of the will for reasons of personal conflict of interest, they would be immediately removed as executors, and the will would be executed exactly as written. And guess who walked into the lawyer's office at that moment? My grandmother, Dorothy. Turns out my grandmother had been monitoring this whole situation from the beginning because she knew my parents well enough to know they'd try something like this. She'd told the lawyer and the other executors what was happening, and they all agreed that my dad had a massive conflict of interest and was acting against my grandfather's express wishes. It was like watching a superhero arrive to save the day. Seriously. My grandmother told my dad, in front of everyone, that he should be ashamed of himself. That his own father had left very clear instructions, and he was trying to manipulate the situation to benefit his favorite daughter at his other child's expense. She said, child, literally, and I almost cried right there. My dad was removed as executor immediately. The will was executed exactly as my grandfather had written it. I received my full $500,000. Madison received hers. But obviously the family was completely fractured after this. My parents were furious with me, as if I had done something wrong by refusing to give away my inheritance. My mom sent me like 20 text messages saying I was a terrible son, that I was greedy, that I destroyed the family over money. All those things that make you feel horrible even when you know you're not at fault. Like a month later, there was a family gathering. I think it was someone's birthday or something. I don't remember. Well, and I went because my grandmother asked me to go. It was a mistake. My parents spent the whole night making passive-aggressive comments, and then my dad started drinking too much and started yelling at me in front of everyone. He told me I was a selfish piece of shit, that I only cared about money, that I'd left my sister with nothing because of my greed. And I finally exploded and told him, she wasn't left with nothing. She received exactly the same as me, $500,000. How is that being left with nothing? And he just yelled that it wasn't enough for her, that she needed more. Some relatives had to intervene and basically escorted my dad outside, and I left immediately after. That night, my grandmother came to my house and told me something I didn't know. Turns out that about 6 months before he died, my parents had tried to convince my grandfather to change his will to leave everything to Madison. They'd told him I didn't need the money, that I was fine on my own, that Madison was the one who needed support. But my grandfather had flatly refused. My grandmother told me he'd been very upset by that conversation, that he'd told her he couldn't believe his own children could be so unfair to their grandson, and that's why he'd put that specific clause in the will about conflicts of interest, because he knew my parents might try something after his death. After that, I cut contact with my parents almost completely. But something unexpected happened. Like 2 months after the drama, Madison called me. We hadn't really talked since the whole inheritance thing, because I honestly didn't know what to say to her. I thought maybe she was going to yell at me too, but instead she asked if we could meet for coffee. I agreed, mainly out of curiosity. We met at a coffee shop near my house, and it was super awkward at first. But then Madison told me something I never expected to hear. She said, I need to apologize to you. She admitted that, throughout all this time, she'd known our parents favored her, that she'd always known but she'd ignored it because it was convenient for her. She said that when she found out my parents were trying to take my inheritance to give it to her, at first she didn't say anything because part of her thought, well, if they want to give me more money, why not? But that later she realized how horrible the whole situation was, that our parents had basically treated me like garbage my whole life, and she'd never done anything to defend me. I told her she was right, that it had hurt me so much that she'd never said anything, that she'd never admitted things weren't fair. And she cried, like really cried, and said she was afraid of losing our parents' love if she went against them, that she'd gotten used to being the favorite and didn't know how to change that. But that now she realized the favoritism had screwed us both up in different ways, that she'd never developed real independence or skills to solve her own problems, because our parents always rescued her, and that wasn't healthy either. It was a long and difficult conversation, but honestly it was the first time I felt like I really knew my sister as a person, and not just as the family's golden princess. She told me she was going to use her inheritance to move out of our parents' house and go to college, that she was going to study finance or business administration, something that would give her real skills to get a real job. And she did it. Literally did it. She enrolled in the local university for the spring semester and found a small apartment she could afford with part of her inheritance while investing the rest. Our parents, of course, went crazy. My mom called Madison like 1,000 times, crying, saying, how could she abandon them like that? That they needed her at home. That she was making a terrible mistake. My dad tried to convince her that if she went to college, they weren't going to support her at all, as if that was some kind of threat when she literally had $500,000. At one point, my dad even threatened to sell the family home because if Madison left, they didn't want to live there alone with all the memories. It was pure manipulative drama, honestly. But Madison stood firm, and I was super proud of her. Honestly, we started seeing each other regularly. Like every 2 weeks, we'd have coffee or lunch, and it was weird but good to build a real sibling relationship for the first time in our lives. She'd ask me for advice about money, about college, about how to deal with the guilt our parents constantly threw at her, and I'd help her however I could. With my inheritance, I paid off all my student loans, which were like $120,000, which was amazing, literally that weight lifting off my shoulders. I invested a good part of the rest in a diversified portfolio. My financial advisor helped me put together. I donated $50,000 to mental health organizations because, after this whole situation, I realized how much therapy had helped me, and I wanted other people to have access to those resources. And I started a small scholarship fund in my grandfather's name for students who come from difficult family situations. It's nothing huge, but each year I can give 1 or 2 students some help for college. My mom tried to reconcile with me like a month ago. She sent me a long message saying she'd started therapy, that she was realizing some things about how she'd raised Madison and me, and that she wanted to talk. I agreed to meet her, mainly because my grandmother asked me to give her a chance. It was an okay conversation, I guess. She apologized for some things, admitted she'd favored Madison, but also made a lot of excuses about how she'd had a difficult childhood and was projecting her own problems, the typical non-apology, apology kind of thing. I told her I appreciated that she was in therapy and hoped she'd really work on her issues, but that I was going to need time to decide if I wanted to rebuild our relationship. My dad, on the other hand, is still being a complete ass. He hasn't changed anything, still acts like I did something horrible to him, like I'm the villain of this story. He still tells relatives who will listen that I'm greedy and that I destroyed the family over money. My grandmother says he'll probably never change, that some people are like that and it's not worth the emotional stress to keep trying. Honestly, I think she's right. Last week, Madison called me super excited because she'd just gotten an A in her financial accounting class. She told me she'd never felt so proud of herself, that for the first time in her life, she felt like she was achieving something on her own merits and not because our parents rescued her. And I felt happy for her, genuinely happy, because despite everything that happened, I think this horrible situation ended up freeing us both in ways we didn't expect. Purged her from our parents' suffocating dependence, and me from the need to keep seeking their approval. Am I still angry about everything? Yes, of course. There are days when I think about everything my parents did, about all the times they ignored me or made me feel invisible, and my blood boils. There are days when I wonder what my life would have been like if I'd had parents who supported me the way they supported Madison. But I also realize that all that adversity made me stronger, more independent, more determined to build a life that didn't depend on anyone else. I'm not saying abuse or emotional neglect is okay or makes you a better person, because that's a lie. But in my case, I survived and found my way despite them, not thanks to them. My grandmother Dorothy is still my favorite person in the whole family. She's like 75 now, but she's super active and sharp, and I literally don't know what I would have done without her through all this. She tells me all the time that my grandfather, I would be proud of how I handled the situation, that he always knew I was stronger than my parents gave me credit for. Sometimes I think about what it would be like if he were still alive, to see Madison going to college and becoming independent. I think he would have loved it. I don't know what's going to happen with my relationship with my parents long term. Maybe over time my mom and I can find some kind of functional relationship, especially if she really commits to her therapy. With my dad, honestly, I don't have much hope. Some people just don't want to see they're wrong. and I think he's one of those people. And that's okay, I guess. I've learned you can't force people to change, and that sometimes blood family isn't the family that really supports you or values you. What I do know is that I'm not going to let them make me feel guilty for standing up for my rights and claiming what my grandfather wanted me to have. That money represents much more than just financial security. For me, it represents validation that at least one person in my family of origin saw me as equal to Madison, that at least one person thought I deserved the same opportunities and the same support, and that means everything, honestly.